Hi, I'm Caitlin.
Hi, I'm Rebecca.
We're not from Memphis, but we love it.
Welcome to Memphis Type History, the podcast.
Today on the podcast, I'm talking to Mark Fleischer, the guy behind Storyboard Memphis at storyboardmemphis.com, and he is going to tell us about Union and Madison Avenues. And so buckle up, we're going to have a really good time, and we're going to really dive into some of the charming, not so charming, and opportunities and wonderful bits about Union and Madison in Midtown Memphis.
Oh my gosh, where do I start? I do a little bit of consulting work for the payroll industry of all things.
I love it.
Long career.
Making sure we get our checks.
That's right. Long career in the payroll industry doing consulting work. And been in Memphis for about 2 years, a little bit less than 2 years. Kind of parlayed my interest in history in general and various hobbies in writing and historical research into my arrival in Memphis. And became immediately interested in Memphis history. It's got such an incredible history, from civil rights back to the days of the Civil War. It's got such an incredible history, but it's more than the history that grabbed me. It was really something else that grabbed me about Memphis that I haven't exactly been able to pinpoint. Until recently, I feel like I've pinpointed what kind of has driven me to explore Memphis history. But I do a little bit of that, and I started a magazine that I'm calling Storyboard Memphis.
And that's mostly how Rebecca and I know you, is from Storyboard.
Exactly. I started following you on your Instagram and from your lovely book, which was one of the first books I purchased here in Memphis to explore Memphis history.
Ooh, that's a lot of pressure.
Yeah, so when you started the podcast is when I reached out to y'all, and I just knew that we all had to talk, and here we are.
You have Storyboard. I know you dabble in some other things. I think Storyboard is the most, I guess, directly accessible Memphis history activity, we can say, that you're doing. And tell us a little bit about that.
So Storyboard Memphis started out, first of all, as a blog. It was my wife when we first got here, when I started really exploring the history of the city, spending time at the library, digging into all the digital resources we have, and pulling up book after book after book. And my wife suggested, why don't you start a blog on your discovery of Memphis? So I thought, okay, that'd be kind of cool, and I've done a fair share of writing in my life. So the blog, first of all, it was Memphis for New Memphians. But this little blog it started out that way, and it was just off the top of my head, my little discoveries of Memphis being new here. The more I got into the history, the more the articles that I was writing became more structured. And the more structured they became, and the more I started to explore various ways to tell stories, the more I realized that I had myself an idea for a magazine. And did my research as far as what to call it, and eventually settled on the idea of storyboard, which I'm so happy I did, because the idea of a storyboard is that folks come in from various talents and skills and contribute their little take on a story. It could be a photograph, it could be a work of art, it could be something written, it could be a sculpture. And a storyboard is a series of contributors or collaborators. It has slowly but surely evolved into that, where I've gotten a few other contributors and collaborators around town who have contributed their take on a story, or we've collaborated on a story, or it's been a story of their own completely. And it's continuing to evolve. So I started that part of it in basically February, March of this year. But the blog is what became the magazine.
I think that's really interesting, because you're kind of going to give us a little bit of a magazine today, because I think you're going to talk to us about Midtown neighborhoods and give us a bit of a 101 or a primer on the history of some Midtown neighborhoods. So we're going to have a little magazine episode today.
There we go.
Yeah. Well, I have no idea other than that what we're going to talk about. So go for it.
Well, the first thing was my first exposure to quote-unquote Midtown was from a gentleman out east that I talked to in the first few months I was here. And, you get the questions of, how did you come to Memphis, or where did you settle in Memphis and all that? I said, well, we're going to be originally the first place we lived in Memphis was at the Kimbrough Towers, which I had no idea at the time that this was considered Midtown. I didn't know what Midtown was. I didn't know Midtown any differently than I knew Collierville or Germantown. So I discovered that the Kimbrough was in this area called Midtown. And the gentleman that I talked to when I first got here told me that Midtown is kind of like our version of Greenwich Village. More eclectic, more entertainment, more diverse restaurants. And I thought, okay, that's interesting. And I thought, first of all, I felt very lucky that I settled in Midtown. And as I discovered, the more I learned about Memphis and Midtown, the more I realized how unique Midtown is to the rest of Memphis.
Yeah.
And of course, I discovered the borders of Midtown, which, depending on who you talk to, can be anywhere from the parkways, East Parkway to South Parkway to North Parkway to Cleveland or the 240. It all depends on who you're talking to.
Yeah, I'm sitting here thinking, we can talk about anything, but this is something, this is really a fight I just don't want to have. But, you're saying it, so it's on you, man.
Well, it's interesting because I'm on a Midtown board.
Just step right into that controversy, sure.
Yeah, exactly. So being on a Midtown board, you get into various fights in Midtown. And suddenly you find yourself working with Binghamton. And, so you get involved in a development and you realize that, wait a second, I'm on a Midtown board. Why are we stepping in for Binghamton? They're not really Midtown, or are they? And so that's where the borders kind of stretch out beyond the traditional parkways, beyond Overton Park. And I've talked to people who say, well, I'm near Highland, which is, half a mile or a mile east of the parkways. And they say, well, I consider myself a Midtowner. And I think, well,
yeah,
I don't know. So there's and I'm using air quotes right now. There's Midtown and there's Midtown, right?
Midtown and Greater Midtown.
Greater Midtown, right. If you go south of Southern, there are people that say, well, I live in Midtown as well. And I think, well, and I hardly have been down south of Southern. But
So what do you think it is? It's not geography, really. Is it just feeling? Or is it just, it's kind of the closest main area, so it's just the easiest to identify with? Or what's that thing?
What's that thing? Well, there's the Midtown mindset. That would be one.
Okay.
That would be one way to identify Midtown. There would be Midtown as far as the actual geography. If I'm a real estate agent, I might be selling a home that's considered Midtown, even though it's East Button or something. So it goes back to who you're talking to, I suppose, and how you're framing it. Boy, I'm going to get myself into big trouble with this conversation. What's Midtown and what isn't Midtown?
Yeah, this is great. We're going to get so many downloads.
Like you said.
We're going to be like, did you hear about this podcast? They just talk the whole hour about what's Midtown and what's not. You have to listen and then tell them all about what you think.
Exactly.
It'll be great.
Yeah.
What do you think? So, but you said Midtown mindset. So what is that? Let's just dig that hole deeper.
Let's dig even deeper than this. The Midtown mindset. Oh my gosh. I would think it goes back, from the people I know, it goes back to the little old ladies who fought for Overton Park and fought the expressway or fought the 240 from going through Overton Park. That the Midtown mindset is activist.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, if you're getting into the grander scheme of things, it's definitely mostly white. When you look at the traditional Midtown, when East Memphis, when downtown, when Germantown talks about Midtown, I think they're really talking about white Midtown, middle class, Central Garden residents, Evergreen residents, people who own businesses up and down Cooper. I think that's what people think of when they think of Midtown from the rest of Memphis. So the Midtown mindset, again, I'm going to dig myself into a big hole here. From looking at the rest of Memphis and their view of Midtown, that's what it might be.
Okay. I mean, what would you say? Would you say that view is what it really is, or would you say there's a lot more to it?
Oh, no, there's a lot more to it.
Right.
Midtown is so eclectic. It's so diverse.
Because that's what I always liked about it. We were lucky enough. We first moved to Memphis and, we looked all around for where we were going to live, and we just sort of lucked out on picking Cooper Young. Mm-hmm. And I think it's a huge reason why we loved Memphis so much, because we lived in the center of things. And I liked how eclectic it was, especially coming from Mississippi. It was a nice change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, more recently I've discovered, too, that much of Midtown I feel like the most residents in Midtown feel like they have a real say in what happens in their city. Where in other parts of Memphis, you go to South Memphis, you go to Fraser, where I think a lot of folks don't feel like they have a say, and they really have to fight for it. They have to fight hard for a say in what happens in their neighborhood. Whereas in Midtown, we kind of have the attitude that, no, this is my neighborhood, and you're not going to put that bank on that corner. You're not going to put that development on that corner.
Interesting.
Generally speaking, and it could be just the circles that I'm around. But that's what when I think of the Midtown persona, I think of those types of things, that most Midtown residents feel like they have a true say in what happens in there. And not just our community, but also in the rest of Memphis to a degree. I
imagine, so you're going to give us the history of some various greater Midtown areas, and I suppose some of that eclectic feel is going to come out, I'm imagining.
Sure. Now, I'll do bits and pieces.
Okay.
Bits and pieces, meaning still being so new here. That is one thing I do love. I love being the outsider, in a sense, because for me, everything that I learn, it's a brand new discovery, And that's a handicap, but also an advantage. And the handicap is that I just don't inherently know what was on a corner or what happened in a certain neighborhood. So I'm discovering these things through word of mouth, through research, through talking to older residents. I definitely approach history from the outsider's point of view and telling a story around those things. But back to Midtown, if we were to look at the history of Midtown, first of all, it was not always called Midtown.
What?
It was once East Memphis.
No, really?
Absolutely.
Ooh. Take that, you Midtowners. You're actually East Memphis. You just didn't know it.
If you were to step into 1920 or 1930, 1940 even, Midtown was East Memphis. In fact, if you go back even further to 1905, 1910, the eastern borders of Memphis were, if you go back even far enough, you go to Dunlap, and then from there it would have gone to, it would have stopped at Cooper, or Cupper, as some say. I had to learn that one too, that Cooper is not Cooper, it's Cupper, depending on, who you talk to, and that McLean is pronounced McLean.
Yeah.
But up until 1909, Memphis ended at the Parkway. And it goes from there, but in those days, what we now know as Midtown was East Memphis.
Which is why we have so many big mansions right around there, I believe.
That's one of many reasons, actually, yeah.
Ooh. Are you going to tell me the others? Is that part of this or no?
Maybe.
Do I have to have a different mansions episode, maybe?
It depends on what I can remember off the top of my head here. If we were to talk about neighborhoods, though, I think the easiest thing for me to do would be to look at some of the more recent stories I've done. And one of the most recent things that I've been working on is kind of doing a little story on Union Avenue.
Ooh.
Yeah, which when I first got here, because we lived at the Kimbrough when we first got here, and from the Kimbrough, we looked over right onto Union. From a brand new, I can't say Memphian, but a brand new Memphis resident.
Oh, so bland.
Union looks like a big mess of fast food restaurants, and it looks like the biggest city planning mess that you could possibly imagine. No turn lanes. 3 lanes on each side crammed into small spaces. Inconsistent sidewalks. Some areas with no sidewalks except just one long driveway that goes along an entire strip mall. From my vantage point in the Kimbrough, I probably saw at least a crash a day. So you'd look out there, you'd see yet another someone trying to turn left or turn right or turn out of a storefront, and boom. My first exposure to Memphis, I thought, okay, I prefer Madison. Madison looks like a traditional old street with great storefronts. You've got the trolley tracks that go all the way up, past Cleveland. Front Street, Front Street's a great street. Parts of Peabody. You go up and down Peabody in Central Gardens. That's a beautiful street. And then you look at Union and you kind of think, what the hell happened? So as I've discovered, as the more research I've done on Union, I kind of look at Union as kind of like the sibling that didn't get all the attention, or got the wrong kind of attention, or the middle child who didn't get the right attention.
Yeah.
I feel sorry for Union Avenue now. And looking back at the history of Union, I've discovered that, it really has such a rich history. It has not been treated well. Union is one of those streets in Memphis that has not been treated very well. But it's got a rich history. If you go way back and look at the city when all of our mass transit was trolley. So when the trolley lines went in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, we had trolley lines going up and down Madison, up and down, or I should say east and west, out Madison, Poplar, Peabody, even on Central. But Union did not have a trolley line. And that actually goes back to the Crump administration back in the 1880s, 1890s, where he kind of held out, hoping that at some point, because all the trolley lines were privately owned in those days, they were not consolidated, and Crump wanted eventually to spare Union for a competing trolley line that would be owned by the city. So he held out. Shocker. Yeah. So Union was, no trolley lines were built along Union. In fact, actually, there was a trolley line that went along Union through downtown, but stopped at Marshall. So that little corner of Marshall where Sun Studios is now, the trolley line stopped there, and then it went south from there, and then eventually ended up onto Peabody and went out. So the idea was that at some point Union would have a city-owned trolley system, but eventually the automobile kind of took over from there. And in 1924, the city put together its first comprehensive plan. And as part of that plan, the idea had been to make Madison the main route that went from downtown all the way out east. And if you look at the map and you look at the history of Madison Avenue, that would make sense because, at Madison in front, the addresses start at 0. They go north, they go south, and of course they go east. It makes sense that Madison would have been the main thoroughfare that went out east. However, Madison Avenue had a trolley line. Union was already wide enough, was already used for vehicular traffic. So in 1924, Union had its first expansion, first widening. Haven't gotten that far in the history of that part of it just yet, but it was wide enough for 2 lanes going each way.
Okay.
Yeah. But what's interesting about that is that as we look at Union back in the 1910, 15, 1920s looked a little bit more like Peabody than what we know as Union today. Mansions, as you mentioned, a lot of mansions, a few storefronts here and there. And in the 1920s, some storefronts were beginning to be built. So a lot of the storefronts that we know, the older storefronts where the Wild Smith drugstore is, for example, or was just demolished recently, those were built in the 1920s.
So do you have some pictures of that?
I do.
Of the house and stuff? Okay, good, because I'd really like to see them. And I think, so we'll put them at memphistypehistory.com/union. That'll be this week's show notes link, and so you can find all the pictures there.
Okay. It's really interesting to look at Union. Most of the pictures of Union are either from the 1920s or they jump forward to the 1950s and 60s. Most of the pictures I've seen so far anyway.
Interesting.
Whole host of photographs I'm sure out there that I have yet to discover.
Send them to us if you've got them, all you listeners. Send them our way.
Yeah,
Or
seriously.
send them Mark's way at Storyboard, or send them our way at Memphis Type History. We want to see them.
Yeah, but it's fascinating to look at these pictures and look at Union as more of a quaint road.
Yeah, I can't even imagine it that way. That's what I was like, wait, Pixar didn't happen. I cannot.
Yeah. It really is amazing. For example, the entrance to Central Gardens, the entrance gates on Belvedere and Union that are now far back into Belvedere, past the fast food restaurant, past the Shell station. They're more into Belvedere. Those were right at Union. So if you were going up and down Union, the entrance gates into Belvedere and the Central Gardens were right there on top of the street. There were trees up and down the avenue. There are more storefronts right on top of the avenue, and small storefronts. A Pig and Whistle, a Fortune's Drive-In, the old Wild Smith, what we now know as Happy Day Laundry. All those things were up and down Union, and it was walkable. Imagine that.
What?
I know that it's interesting to me that we're looking at Memphis 3.0, and we're looking at the long-term vision for Union Avenue is to make it more bike-friendly and more pedestrian-friendly. Well, we're going back in time, essentially, when we look at that, because that's the way it was in the 30s, 40s, 50s, even to a degree to the 60s. It was still walkable. Central Garden's history is filled with residents who talk about walking to Union and going to these various places, going to get a milkshake, going to the drugstore, and so on.
I mean, it'd be great. Parking is so hard if you're going somewhere in Union.
That's an ongoing battle too. But it's amazing to look at Union Avenue in those days and look at really a beautiful streetscape. In the early 60s, it was widened again, which I am still dying to get into some of that history and see some of those old pictures to see the actual widening, because if you look really closely at Union and you look at the pictures from the 1950s, it's very difficult to pinpoint exactly where did they make those, curb cuts. Where did they expand? Was it on the north side of Union? I'm not exactly sure. Were there places on the south side of Union where they made those cuts, to widen the avenue? I'm not exactly sure. I'm sure there's plenty of folks in city planning that have all these archives that I can access at some point. But
yeah.
But it really is. It's amazing to see what it used to look like, and that's why I've grown to feel sorry for Union Avenue versus looking at it with some kind of contempt. One of the first things I wrote about when I started doing the blog originally, before it was Storyboard, was I was right in the middle of reading a great book by Wanda Rushing. It's called Memphis and the Paradox of Place, and the idea of place is what is unique to a city, unique to a neighborhood, unique to a street. And she talks a lot about in that book a sense of place. What makes Memphis, Memphis? I would look at Union, and I would look at, and I think, well, that could be any town, any main street, anywhere in the U.S. practically. When you look at the signage and the fast food places and the banks, it could look like any suburban street in the U.S. And I would write about the fact that Union seems to have lost its sense of place. Madison, no. You go up and down parts of Madison, the parts of Madison that are still intact, some of the old 1920s, 30s storefronts, and it still has a unique sense of place. It still feels like what Memphis used to feel like. Cupper, whatever you want to say. Still has that sense of place. The Cooper Young neighborhood has that sense of place. South Main, South Front Street still has that sense of place. They're still unique. You can look at some of those corners and realize this is exactly what it looked like, or close to what it looked like in the 1920s or 1930s. But then I looked at Union, not so much. Almost desecrated, if you will, when you look at the changes.
So, can I ask you a question, though? Do you feel like having a sense of place is a precondition of that it retains some of its former self in some way?
Some of its former self, partially, but also not overrun by another Kentucky Fried Chicken or another Wendy's restaurant that you can see anywhere in the country. Those things, I think, is what contributes to losing a sense of place. Like an Olive Garden in the middle of Times Square, for example.
Right.
If you're going to have Italian food in New York City, you should go where there's something authentic. Olive Garden is anywhere in the country. It doesn't depend on a place. Olive Garden is Olive Garden. McDonald's is McDonald's. Wendy's is Wendy's, no matter where you go.
So, and I'm kind of taking, we're just saying business names, but I'm also thinking it goes a little deeper than that. Like, if it's a McDonald's, it's a McDonald's building. It then leads into the architecture, which I think is a huge element of sense of place.
Oh, totally.
Is that. And so, I know we're kind of like chains, but I think chains bring that generic architecture. I would say maybe a stronger component of
The architecture.
that lack of place is the fact that like fast food chains all look the same. And so then it,
Yeah. I mean, if you could, for example, put a McDonald's into a 1920s storefront and use the traditional storefront's signage, you'd still be retaining that storefront sense of place, but putting in, a fast food chain. Whereas what typically happens is that storefront is torn down and, in any town, McDonald's goes in its place,
Yeah.
But
It's interesting. I've seen several examples here in China of, Starbucks is huge here.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen several examples where they've integrated really well with the architecture of where that store is. And as much as I don't drink Starbucks, it's not my favorite thing really. But I do appreciate it's probably going to be here anyway. At least they're not intrusive as a brand about it. They've kind of integrated their brand into the traditional Chinese building that's here on the street or whatever. Or like sometimes Starbucks is actually in Chinese, things like that.
Yeah, and that's a really hard sell if you're a corporation.
Yeah.
Because
it's branding and...
Exactly. And you want to stand out from the rest, and, when it comes to McDonald's, for example, everyone looks for the golden arches, right?
Yeah.
And if I were a president or owner of a corporation, I'd want the same thing. I'd want my brand out there. I wouldn't want it to be integrated or enmeshed in, the rest of the streetscape. I'd want it to stand out. So that's not to fault any corporation or any fast food chain for that. I think it's really up to a city. When we start looking at that from that perspective, it's up to the city to keep retaining its sense of place, all the way from residents, all the way through city council, commission, city planning commissions to mayors and so on. It's up to the city to retain its sense of place.
So I'm not certain, but I'm sensing that there might be a turning point in the story for you about Union. It's maybe I thought Union was the worst street, but...
I don't know. I hope so.
Well, have you discovered some... I see what you're saying, and I certainly had the same feelings in many ways about Union, I think, when I first got to Memphis, but... the more I was on it, the more I went to different places. I could kind of see little bits of hey, actually, this is a little interesting. This street is actually, it's inconvenient as a street in general. But other than that, look at this building or look at this weird old store. I can see flavor. I can see flavor on Union. I don't know the history behind the little places and all of that, but I think there's definitely some stuff to Union. There
is. There's a lot. There's a lot of great 1920s, 30s storefronts along Union. But if you think about the timing of things, early 1920s, the new city plan had to establish a new route east. There was no 240. Union had already had the basic infrastructure to have a wide street that can accommodate vehicles. Right. And in those days, they were only going 30 miles an hour. So it felt like a safe enough avenue to provide that kind of transportation. And as a result, it became one of the things I read in one of Paul Kopic's books. It became, automobile central, because if you think about the eastern migration of Memphis from the 1920s on, Union was the avenue that allowed you to just drive east. You weren't going to drive necessarily along the trolley lines. You could, but if you wanted to quickly get east, you were going to take Union. So as a result, all the development that went into Union had to be vehicle-centric. It had to provide some parking, and right off the street parking. So as a result, you had these beautiful storefronts that were built, era storefronts, 1920s, 1930s era storefronts that were built, but they were built off the street, so you could easily pull in and park. That makes perfect sense. Right. That's what I find. I think that might be what you're talking about, how some of those storefronts are interesting. But then you look at Union and you realize, I can't walk this thing. I mean, I can if I want to take my life into my hands, unless I'm walking right along the storefronts. But then again, they weren't really built for walking. The Union was built and widened for vehicular traffic. But there are all those little pieces that are so interesting along Union. It's almost as if you don't know how to address that kind of problem. You don't know how to address what occurred in the 1920s as far as the building of, or the development of Union Avenue in those days. It's very awkward. It's not pedestrian friendly. It never was.
It's interesting to me to realize it was never intended to be. It's very interesting because the things that are maybe troublesome about it are intentional. It's doing what it was meant to do.
It's doing what it was meant to do when you were only traveling 25 or 30, 35 miles an hour at best.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
Yeah, and when there were only 2 lanes each way.
Yeah. Do you know any of these little, the older buildings or any little pockets of history? Is there anything that that you could tell us about or a story or two? I like being told stories.
Like being told stories. Well, we lost a couple of historic structures on it, and I have to use the term historic very loosely because they weren't on the National Register of Historic Places. They weren't part of any kind of Midtown Historic District overlay, which is the legislative arm that allows a neighborhood to protect its historic structures. So we lost some old storefronts. We lost some 1920 storefronts just recently, partially due to fire and partially due to new development. And it's the old Wild Smith drugstore, which was there, since the 1940s or 50s, I believe, which, oh my gosh, there are hundreds, thousands of people who went to Wild Smith drugstore and got a milkshake. So
good.
Oh, yeah. And I wish I had been here for that. I missed it because they closed their doors in either 2014 or 2015.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah. And then a few doors down from there, you had the Happy Day Cleaners.
Great sign.
Yeah, a great sign. And I just learned recently that they would deliver your clothes to you.
That's so charming. I love it.
Yeah, I don't know how recently that took place, but I learned that they delivered clothes. My wife's good friend worked there back in her high school days. So we're going back into the 80s and 90s, essentially. But she worked at Happy Day Cleaners. She would, they would deliver your clothes for you. And, of course, they always advertised that one-day service that was on the sign, next-day service. But we lost those 2 structures. One was due to a fire, and the rest of the storefronts along that part of Union were recently demolished. Most of them were vacant anyway, sold to a couple gentlemen, and it makes sense that they would want to redevelop that property. But what's interesting to me, too, is to look at another corner right there, Roselle and Belvedere. So a Union between Roselle and Belvedere. But that corner, which is so troublesome right now with the Shell station and then the car wash, which, God love them, as far as if you own that car, I would love to own that car wash, but it sits up right up against, Central Gardens residents and right in people's backyards. Well, that property was the old Midwest Dairy or Fortunes drive-in.
Oh, interesting.
And that has a whole great little history to it as well. But that old Midwest dairy went away in the 1980s. Another one of those battles that were fought and lost to developers. And
why are all these dairy farms and dairy things in Midtown? Do you know that? Do you know why?
Do I know why? Yeah, you're talking about the
There's just always cow-related something whenever I'm looking at.
Well, they are necessary entities, right?
It's just funny. Now it's funny. It's like, this is the middle of the city.
Yeah.
What is this? But it wasn't, back then.
But it wasn't, and every little town had its own local dairy and a drive-through, drive-through dairy. I mean, it's hugely convenient and it's quaint, but it's of a different era, really. Same thing with the Turner Dairy, the Turner Prairie Farms Dairy up there on Madison. Same thing. It had its quaint history with the little trucks and deliveries and the drive-through and all those things, but that's of a different era. Like anything else, your business does well, you want to expand your business, and eventually your business expands to different states and becomes regionalized and so on, and you've got yourself, instead of a little quaint little Midtown or neighborhood dairy, you've got yourself a distribution center, then does not fit a little town, right? But why the Midwest dairies, why they left that property, I don't exactly know. But I just find it interesting that fits the mold of what the rest of Union was in the 30s, 40s, 50s, which was still small town. Living in Central Gardens, I'm lucky enough to be able to do usually a monthly history, and I kind of pick a different era or a different topic when it comes to Central Gardens history, and Union Avenue happens to be the one recently. So Barbara Weiser has a great book called Stories of a Neighborhood, and in that book she talks about, because she did exhaustive history, interviews and research on the history of Central Gardens, interviewed tons of people, and they all talk about growing up in Midtown and again walking up to Union and visiting these local establishments, which were family owned. A few streets over on Barksdale, one of the first Piggly Wigglies was on Barksdale, which now is a new development or newer development they call Peabody Green, which is on the property that was the parking lot of the old Central Library, which is right there on McLean, and Peabody. That's a whole other history that is wonderful. If you look at the history of that corner, right there, it went from a farmhouse to a few smaller houses. Then eventually, 1955, it was the new Central Library, the main library. And then, of course, that outgrew Memphis. That was relocated out to East Memphis, where it is now, of course. But that's a whole other history that is just amazing. But that little stretch of Barksdale right there was one of the first Piggly Wigglies back in the 30s and 40s.
Very cool. Where are you taking us next?
Well, let's see. Another little thing that I uncovered, which is really fun, is that that corner on McLean and Peabody that is now the Starbucks. If I had an audience, I would ask, who knows what that used to be? It was the Ponchos.
Oh, Ponchos.
It was one of the Ponchos restaurants, which shut its doors, I think 1999 is what I had. But that was the old Ponchos. And, of course, not being from Memphis, I had no idea what Ponchos was all about, except for the fact that they had this great cheese sauce in the, Kroger refrigerated section, right?
Yeah.
So my wife introduced me. That was one of the things my wife introduced me to. Like, you got to try Ponchos, because you can't get Ponchos cheese dip anywhere else, right?
Yeah.
And it's quite addicting. But I did not know, of course, until talking to various people and talking to her, that Ponchos was a restaurant. So Ponchos, that was one of the Ponchos restaurant was right there on McLean and Peabody. Another one is out on way out on Summer Avenue. And then the other one, of course, in West Memphis, right on the other side of the river. I have yet to visit Ponchos.
I went as a kid.
Did you go to the West Memphis one? Did you go to the one on McLean?
I really don't remember. I was really little. But my mom is from Memphis, and my mom and dad lived there when they were younger, and so I went at some point as a kid. I don't remember which one, but I remember going, and I remember seeing the sign. Mom be like, "Oh, it's Ponchos," and talking about Ponchos. She loved that place.
Yeah, I need to go there, but it's funny growing up in California. We had two types of Mexican food, so to speak. Growing up there, we had Americanized Mexican food, which was like the Taco Bell, and you had it was a little bit like how they describe Ponchos. So not necessarily real authentic, Mexican cuisine necessarily, but kind of an Americanized version of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's how I've learned. That's how I've learned that Ponchos was kind of like that.
Tons of cheese, it's just,
Tons of cheese, tons of sauce. If you mix it all tastes the same if you mix it all together on your plate,
Yeah.
Yeah. The plates come out hot. Don't touch it,
Oh, man.
Yeah.
I'm getting hungry.
Mm-hmm. That is what's so fascinating to me about Midtown, is it has that history. So it's not just Union. It's, I've started to delve into the history of Madison Avenue in Midtown, which is equally as fascinating.
Yeah, let's do Madison. I love Madison.
Yeah. So Madison, that is what Madison Avenue is kind of what got me on the Memphis map, if you were to coin a phrase, because that Madison is what attracted me, or what fascinated me the most when I first got here.
Why?
Because
here we go.
Because of the fact that it was a streetcar neighborhood.
Okay.
In Midtown, a streetcar neighborhood, and the discovery that that the curvature in Overton Square on Madison and Cooper, on the south side of Madison and Cooper, there, the curvature in the buildings represents the curvature of the trolley line.
So this is interesting because we've talked about a street made for cars, really, I guess. It's sort of, maybe a streetcar would have been put in, but pretty much developed for cars. And now a street developed for streetcars.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And the same applies because the Madison, it was called the East End Railway, East End Line, or Dummy Line they used to call it. But that went from Madison all the way out to Cooper, and then made a right turn at Cooper, went down, it went south, and then it made a left turn at Young, which there's the same curvature. If you think of that corner at Cooper Young,
okay,
you have the same curvature in the buildings that right there in the storefronts as the trolley line would have turned going from South Cooper. It would have turned left and went and traveled east on Young, and then went out to the fairgrounds. Anyway, I became fascinated with Madison Avenue, and that is one of the things that kind of endeared myself, I guess, to Memphis residents, long-term residents, is when I kept talking about Madison Avenue, and I felt like a kid, wide-eyed, looking at, Madison is this and this. It's got these great storefronts. It's got this great history of the streetcar. It's still in terms of traffic flow, it's still slow enough. And I had no idea, at the time, did not know about the history of the bike lanes on Madison Avenue, which is a whole nother controversy, right?
We've had enough controversy today, so we'll just...
Memphis and controversy kind of go hand in hand, don't they?
Oh, yeah. And I'm being silly. If people want to get mad about anything we talked about here, they can just, I don't know, send me an email.
Right.
Yeah, I may or may not answer you.
But Madison, I'll start with, for example, one of the more iconic places in Madison that is now long gone that you know much more than I do, which is the old Andertons.
Yeah, Andertons. We just did a show on that.
Yeah, and all I knew of Andertons is that, well, the first thing I realized is it's gone, first of all. And then the second thing I learned was that everybody had to go to Andertons, is one of those places.
Yeah.
That at one point had this great waiter, or I guess it was waiter service. Now you have to say server. Can't say waiter or waitress anymore, right? And then this great bar, That's the other thing I learned about Anderson. It had this great bar. And then someone said, that bar still exists somewhere. And I went, really? The bar to Anderson's is still around? They said, oh, yeah, it's out on Broad Avenue at the Cove, So at one point I finally got to the Cove and realized that not just the bar is at the Cove, but some of the booths, right?
Yeah. Basically, Andertons is at the, not entirely, but.
Half of the interior of Andertons is at the Cove, yeah. So in kind of discovering the history of Madison Avenue, and then delving into some of these long gone establishments, or some of the places that are still there, like Zinni's, for example, for me, Memphis kind of developed a mythic quality. And when something has a mythic quality to it, you can never uncover it enough. Every time you peel another layer comes up, So Madison really is what started for me my fascination with Memphis. Is if you go from Madison downtown all the way out into Midtown, you've got yourself a pretty good history of Memphis right there.
Can you walk us through it?
I don't think we have enough time for that.
Well, briefly, for people, let's say if someone wanted to do that drive to try to see what you're saying, you have a history of Memphis in that drive. What would be helpful for them to know? What should they be looking for?
Yeah. Well, first thing I would do is I would tell them, go down to Front Street, go down to Front Madison, and stand there at the U of M Law Building, which used to be the Federal Building, I believe, and stand at the stone. I don't know what you call that thing, that square thing that's round, that's made of concrete, that's got stamps in it.
I don't know. That works. What?
But it talks about the address. All the addresses in Memphis begin right there. So they start at 0 from that point. And if you were to strictly go from there east along Madison, the addresses keep going up and up and up, which was really helpful for me as a newcomer to realize that the addresses here mean something. In California, this is the quirkiest thing, but in California, addresses didn't really mean a whole lot. If you said, 12123 Pacific Coast Highway, I'm like, I have no idea where that is. If you tell me a cross street, I can kind of figure it out. Okay. But here, addresses mean something. So if you say, 1480 Madison, I know where that is. If you say 1700 Madison, I know where that is. Same thing in Central Gardens or in the rest of Midtown. The 1400, the 15, 16, 1700 blocks mean something, right?
Yeah.
And I learned that, going back down to Madison in downtown. So you start there. And, there's a lot of that you can walk. You can walk all the way essentially to Danny Thomas Boulevard. But along that Madison walk, you walk past Main Street. You walk past 2nd Avenue, and then from there you go to B.B. King Boulevard, which is 3rd Street, right? You pass the now Napoleon Hotel, which is a gorgeous building. You pass the Steric Building, which is right there, the empty and classic Steric Building. You walk past the back of the AutoZone ballpark, and it's interesting. You can also see where the roadway was built to go over Danny Thomas Boulevard right there, and then goes into the medical district and the Edge district. There past Marshall, and then right there by the Sam Phillips recording studio. And then you go into the medical district. You go past Health Services Park, the old Bedford Forest Park. And then you go into the medical district. Speaking of ballparks, right there in the medical district along essentially the corner of Madison and Pauline, which is where the old Rustwood ballpark used to be, which burned down in 1961, I believe. From there, Madison kind of continues in fits and starts. There's some parking lots, some older structures, there's some newer structures, and then you get into the corner of Cleveland and Madison, which has got some great old storefronts. And if you continue on from there, and through all this, the trolley line continues. So the trolley tracks are all the way through from downtown at Main and Madison, and they kind of terminate. They kind of disappear out of sight. When you pass Cleveland, you keep driving along that corridor, and suddenly no more trolley tracks.
Yeah.
And then past the old laundry, but then you get into where Minglewood Hall is, and you've got yourself some traditional storefronts, and it's all those fits and starts where I realized that Madison, in those fits and starts, still has, going back to that sense of place, still feels like parts of old Memphis. Old as in 1920s, Memphis, when it was a streetcar neighborhood. You go through Madison Heights, you go through the old Idlewild neighborhood, and then next thing you know, you're passing Huey's, and then you're into Overton Square.
Yeah, which is great. Overton Square is so much history.
So much history. Another little something I discovered in your work is with the old French Quarter Hotel right there on the corner. Yeah, Madison and Cooper, which is now Ballet Memphis.
Yeah, we even have some photographers that will go with contributing writers sometimes and like take pictures of stuff, and so they went and documented right before. So it's kind of interesting because it's abandoned pictures of it, but yeah, that place. I mean, we get so many stories of people talking about that place and the club it was before, which was Solomon Alfred's or Alfred's or something. Depends on time period, who calls it what, but it was that before, I think. So what about, we're back in Midtown on Madison. Mm-hmm. What are some of your favorite stories and things that you've discovered?
So, first of all, there's a whole history of Midtown that I have yet to really delve into, which is folks who kind of grew up, and I say grew up as in probably their early drinking years, who grew up around when the Fridays went in Overton Square.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And I love hearing, again, this is where, for me, Memphis has a mythic quality. Hearing stories of, well, I grew up in Midtown. Oh, wow. You grew up in Midtown. Or I grew up in East Memphis. There's a thing, that's a thing. I grew up here. I'm a Midtowner, and I grew up in Midtown. That's an entire history that I've yet to, that's a part of an onion I have not even gotten to yet. But one of the more recent stories I did was on a house on the corner of Auburndale and Madison, 1726. And my tax attorney, Bruce Newman, it's his building, and little over a year ago, he asked if I would do a little history of the house, and of course, I said yes, and it took me quite some time. But I discovered with this house that and it's just a 4-square house. You wouldn't look at it twice if you drove past it. Most people don't. But as it turns out, there was the first owner of the house was someone named Christopher Hottum, Hottum. I kept up the research, kept looking at the other corners of that part of town. I was almost ready to finish the story. And, with any story, you try to find really good beginning, middle, and end. What's going to draw in the reader, what kind of emotional hook can you give the story and all that. And I thought, okay, I think I got it, but I need to check a few things and do some more research before I finish this up. And I opened up one of Paul Kopech's books and discovered this guy, Christopher Hottum, was kind of a crazy man. First of all, he owned, you didn't call it a saloon quite in those days because you couldn't, but he was a shop owner, a saloon owner, had a place on Madison, 119 Madison. But as it turns out, he was quite a little daredevil in his time. From the late 1800s to 1920s, he put on swim marathons up and down the Mississippi River. He carried on steamboat races.
All right.
He was challenged to jump off the Harahan Bridge because he was told that if you jump on, anyone who jumps off that bridge is going to die. Well, he said, well, I'm going to do it. I'm going to show you that it can be done. So he jumped off the bridge, and he became known as the guy who jumped off the Harahan Bridge. May have been the Frisco Bridge, but anyway, one of the 3 bridges.
Right. He jumped off a bridge. I don't care which one.
And he was a wrestling. There wasn't really much to Memphis wrestling back in the 1920s and 30s, but he promoted wrestling. He was the last promoter for the last bare knuckle fight in Mississippi that they have on record. So he was this crazy promoter, shop owner, saloon owner, and he was the first owner of this house.
Wow. Did he build it? Did he have it built? Or he just...
Probably had it built.
Right,
But that's one little piece that I haven't put it all together yet. But
okay.
Now, it's funny, you talk to your local historians, you talk to, Wayne Dowdy or, Willie Bearden or Jimmy Ogle, and you might say, Christopher Hotham, and they'll say, oh, yeah, I remember, I've read about that guy. But for most people, that name is off in the ether. There was a little clipping in the Commercial Appeal when he passed away at 90 years old or whatever. This, Memphis promoter who was, crazy in his own way, promoter who passed away. He did all these things into his 70s and then got hit by a car in front of the Peabody Hotel.
What?
And was an invalid for the last 10 or so years of his life, and in a house in South Memphis.
To do all those things and then just be crossing a street.
Yeah, exactly. But that, again, talk about this mythic quality that Memphis has.
Yeah, it's like even in a random house.
Wait,
a giant lived here.
Yeah. A giant in the day, lived in this little house. And then, as it turns out, the medical building right across Auburndale from this house is where Elvis got his drugs.
Oh, Elvis connection?
Yeah, so
all right.
And that was so of course.
We'll take it, I guess.
There's always an Elvis connection somewhere.
Man.
So that was Dr. Nick.
Okay.
So the infamous Dr. Nick was right across the street from this house. So anyway, that is what's so fascinating to me is that, everywhere you look in Memphis, something crazy, mythical, whatever happened. There's a whole other side to some of the incredibly tragic things that have occurred here. That's a whole other piece that I want to explore at some point. But for now, I'm really, I use the term enmeshed again, enmeshed in the 20th century history.
Yeah.
Of Memphis, mostly Midtown, mostly downtown and all that for the most part.
Interesting.
But the other thing that I find so amazing and that it contributes to this mythology is the fact that there are connections everywhere.
Yeah. You just go down rabbit holes.
No, it is. It's fascinating. Bruce is who owns the house now. He's also an entertainment lawyer.
What?
Yeah. So that was the final.
That's funny. I don't even know what word to use. That's too something.
Yeah. That was the final connection that in terms of, wrapping a bow around the story, that was it. Like, oh, this is just too good. I couldn't make this stuff up, to find after all that, after a year of research to kind of uncover this little tidbit, which turned out to be a huge tidbit, to realize that, someone in entertainment in his own way, another entertainment promoter, Yeah. And now, almost 100 years later, another one. So, I mean, those are the things, and that, like I said, contributes to the mythology that I find here in Memphis. But it's not myth; it actually happened. For me, it's mythological. Being an outsider, looking in, it has that mythology to it. But for those who were here, it happened. And that's actually where I'd like to hold on to my outsider status as long as I can, because I keep looking at it with fresh eyes, like a kid, exploring a new pop-up book. Like, wow, look at all this. Every page you turn, there's something new and something amazing.
I like that. And I think that's what, there are plenty of insiders that feel that way, but there are a lot of outsiders, I think, that really see Memphis with a different set of eyes.
Mm-hmm.
And we've got a lot of listeners, and we've had a lot of blog and book readers people who were born here and kind of still have that spirit of like discovery and exploration about Memphis for sure. But it's definitely something I see a lot with transplants.
Yeah, I see it with transplants. I do see it with people who grew up here. I see it with people who grew up here, left, and then have come
and
back.
came back. Yeah.
I see that a lot. People who have left and have come back have a whole new appreciation for Memphis that they didn't have before. It also is, just so happens that, this is a great time as far as being in Memphis because of the changes, the growth. I mean, sitting here in Crosstown, what this was, and the fact that this place sat empty for 20 years or whatever, to me, and this is why it was so really cool that I could get this spot. Thank you, Gil.
Yes, thank you.
Sears Crosstown, this building has its own mythology and its own amazing history, and it's reborn. And that's the other thing I'm seeing with Memphis. There's a lot of places that are being reborn. Ideas are being reborn, and people who have left and come back are seeing that.
Yeah.
Which is a beautiful thing.
So, is there anything else that you were intending to tell us about Midtown?
Next podcast. How's that?
All right. Well, I've got a few fun questions to ask you.
Okay.
All right. Here we go.
Uh-oh.
If you had to spend eternity in one Memphis neighborhood forevermore, which one would you choose?
My own Central Gardens neighborhood. Put in a plug for my neighborhood. But yeah, I feel very lucky to have landed there. I mean, oh my gosh, it's pretty amazing.
So what about it? Why would you be willing to spend eternity there?
Well, we do have all 4 seasons. That's a plus.
Okay.
You can walk, and I would imagine in eternity, I would not have a car. I would think, but I would have to walk. I would imagine, and so there in Central Gardens, I can walk anywhere. I can experience the beautiful foliage in the fall, and I can experience a random snowfall every now and then. I can see everything turn green in the springtime. I can see the lightning bugs in June. It's got it all.
All right. You must now legally change your first name, and it has to be a Memphis street. Which one do you choose?
Oh, boy. We have a cat named Cooper, so I can't take that one. I'll pick something random. Auburndale. I don't know.
All right. Auburndale Fleischer.
Definitely not Peabody. I don't want to be called Mr. Peabody.
Oh, that's a mouthful. All right. If you wrote a screenplay about a Memphis neighborhood, which home in that neighborhood would be the protagonist?
Which home would be the protagonist? The Crump house.
All right.
That would be a protagonist. Yeah. That's almost an easy one when you think about it. Yeah.
You get a lot of script out of that.
Oh, yeah. Yep. Mm-hmm.
All right. Last one. You have unlimited funds to create anything you want on one street in Memphis. What would you create and where would it be located?
Golly, I love Madison, but I have this pity for Union.
Poor Union, man.
Poor Union. I do. I have this renewed, sense of poor Union needs my attention. And Madison's got its own elements. Peabody's fine. Central's fine. I think I need to do something on Union.
All right. What would it be?
Well, I'm sorry, Wendy's and McDonald's and all that, but you're going away. I'm sorry, all the bank drive-thrus. I'm sorry about the Panera drive-thru, but
you can take it. If you're putting something awesome, you can take it.
It's all going.
I'll give it to you.
It's all going. And I'm restoring some of the old mansions, and I'm restoring some of the old storefronts. I'm actually doing something that was never done. I'm putting a trolley line through it because Union wanted a trolley line, but never got it. And it became paved over and automobilized. So it's going to get its trolley line that it deserves. How's that?
All right.
There you go. That's a good question.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. Someone should work that out so that we can have a trolley on Union and have some old buildings with some cool stuff inside them.
There you go. Yep.
So then tell us what you're working on next. What can people find on Storyboard? StoryboardMemphis.com is where they can go. What kind of stuff are you doing currently? What's upcoming?
Upcoming. There's a lot upcoming. I'm working on a new appreciation for mid-century architecture, which got a lot of contributors on that one, just in terms of understanding. Because I'm not one of those ones who really understands mid-century architecture, but we have a lot of beautiful mid-century architecture in Memphis. So an appreciation for mid-century architecture.
Yeah, we did an episode on that.
Yeah.
Well. And I learned so much. I'll link to it in the show notes.
Yeah, so I'm doing an appreciation for that and some of the things that we've lost. Also, I'm doing kind of a thesis statement on 1920 storefronts and how unique they are to Memphis. So if we have if we have a Memphis commercial style of architecture, if we have one, what does it look like? Is there such a thing? I'm completing my story on the Fuel Cafe and the history of that corner. Mm-hmm. The Warehouse District in down on Front. Doing a little history of that. What else do I have going on? I'm exploring the idea of putting it in print. That's all I want to say about that.
Exciting!
Yeah. I've gotten some interesting feedback from folks about print, especially with the fact that our commercial appeal is not what it used to be.
Yeah.
So we're getting some feedback on the possibility of or the idea of putting something in print.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, everybody, head over to storyboardmemphis.com. There's a lot of really good stuff over there. Yeah, I love it. I mean, great resource and a great take on things. I just you definitely take a scholarly, more research-oriented approach for sure, and really get into the details, which I find really, I love that. That's great. And it's a ton of work, and it's clear you put so much work into every piece you publish. Show notes for this episode are memphistypehistory.com/union, which is this week's show notes with all the cool pictures Mark promised us and loads of links. I've got tons of notes of past podcast episodes that if you like this episode, you're going to like these episodes. They're related. Links to several authors and books that he mentioned. So head there. There's going to be a lot in show notes this week. Well, you've been listening to Memphis Type History, the podcast.
We like your type.
You've been listening to Memphis Type History, the podcast. It would mean so much to us if you head over to iTunes and give us a rating and review. Be sure to subscribe and never miss an episode.
Want to be part of Memphis Type History and get behind-the-scenes content, merch, and more? Support us on Patreon at patreon.com/Memphis Type History. That's Patreon, spelled patreon.com/Memphis Type History.
Find more Memphis Type History on our blog at memphistypehistory.com, on Facebook, Instagram, and Pinterest as Memphis Type History, and on Twitter at Memphis Type.